Hello.
Hello, police.
Yeah, what's the problem, sir?
We just drove down our farm track.
Yeah.
Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it.
Yeah.
It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. And in this video, we take a look at 2 items which were discovered in the back of the Range Rover that were not tested for DNA evidence. We also take a look at some withheld cell data regarding 2 phone calls between Michael Steele and Jack Womes on the evening of the murders of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. So firstly, let's take a look at 2 items which were discovered in the back of the Range Rover containing Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. If we look in the rear offside footwell of the Range Rover, we can see a crisp packet and a Topic bar wrapper. Now, interestingly enough, neither of these items were actually tested for DNA. Now, why I find this incredibly odd is not just the fact that it's a normal police procedure, but the fact that we had the lead investigator, Detective Ivan Dibley, come forward just a day after these actual crimes were committed, stating that he was fairly sure that he knew how this crime was committed. He was looking at the possibility of a 4th person being in the car and a 2nd person waiting down the lane to ambush them. Now, if you'd drawn that conclusion so early on in the investigation, surely the first thing you're going to do is test these wrappers for DNA evidence in order to further your claim that there was a 4th person in the vehicle. Now, when we combine this failure in the investigation stage of this crime and we combine it with the fact that no time of death was recorded for Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, you get the impression that there's almost a muddying of the waters as to who was responsible for this crime. Now, what I mean by that is that there doesn't appear to be any real need or urgency to test every available resource in order to discover who was responsible for these murders. When you look at it in a different way, the less evidence you have pointing in one certain direction, the wider your potential suspect pool can be. If, for instance, we test these wrappers for DNA evidence, and they come back as someone other than Michael Steele, that's going to add a tiny bit of credibility to the fact that he may not have been in the Range Rover on the evening of their deaths. Now, if you are someone who is a believer in the fact that Michael Steele and Jack Womes were framed for these murders, then really the less information pointing in a certain direction, the better. If you have less evidence in a lot of ways, it actually allows you a lot more scope to interview and question a much wider range of suspects. Let's say, for instance, they did a time of death on Tucker, Tate and Rolfe and they established that it happened maybe sometime between 7 and 9 p.m. That's fair enough. Then you are basically looking for someone who was available and able to commit that crime during those hours. But by not having a time of death, it allows you a lot larger scope. So if we don't have a time of death here, we can only assume they died sometime in the evening of December the 6th, up until the morning which they were discovered by the 2 farmers. It gives you a greater scope for potential suspects. Tie that in with the fact that we haven't even tested the wrappers for any DNA evidence. If we have no DNA evidence, it allows us to interview and have more people under suspicion rather than testing those wrappers and them actually not coming back to Michael Steele. I mean, it wouldn't actually say that he wasn't in the vehicle, but it may add just a little bit more credibility for the defence's standpoint that he wasn't in the vehicle on the evening of December the 6th. Now, what I've just said is obviously verging on the edge of conspiracy theory territory, but I've never known of a crime with such potential information and evidence be investigated to such a low degree. How can we have a police surgeon attend the crime scene followed by a Home Office pathologist and not one of them say that they were asked to get the time of death? It's part of their role as a pathologist. but they simply weren't asked, so they didn't bother actually trying to get a time of death. Followed by 2 wrappers in plain view of these officers, which may well tell you who was sitting in the vehicle on the evening of December the 6th, simply thrown in the bin. How can these items not be tested? It's almost as if they didn't want the finger to be pointing in any certain direction. They wanted a large scope in order to investigate this crime themselves. Now, just to back up what I have said, we can take a look at an independent newspaper article from the day after the bodies were discovered. This gives us an idea of the really earliest stages of investigation, really sort of less than 24 hours after the bodies of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were actually found. And it goes on to state the following. Detective Superintendent Dibley said that 6 or 7 shots had been fired at the men from 1 or more shotguns. Rolfe, the driver, and Tucker, the front seat passenger, had been shot in the head, and Tate, who was in the back, was blasted in the head and body. He said, quote, "The shooting was done at very close range. You did not need to be an expert to have achieved what was achieved. I still do not know whether the persons who committed these murders travelled to the scene in that Range Rover or whether they were at the scene before they arrived. It is likely that I am looking for more than one person." Now, it's my own personal opinion here, but I completely disagree with what Detective Ivan Dibley stated here. Just because they were shot from close range, and really they couldn't miss from the distance in which they were firing the gun, that doesn't mean it wasn't carried out by someone who was a professional or someone who had killed before. What you should be looking at is the way in which the bodies were discovered, the positioning of the bodies, and exactly how quick these shots were fired. Not from what distance, but how quickly the shots were fired and how quickly these 3 men were incapacitated. In my opinion, that tells me that it was someone who had maybe killed before. Someone who certainly had a lot of knowledge regarding shotguns and someone who certainly wasn't fearful in committing triple murder. Detective Ivan Dibley's giving us the impression here, or giving the reader the impression here, that really it was an easy job. They had a shotgun and they were shot from such close range that they couldn't miss. But he's missing the main point here, the biggest point of all, and that is how the bodies were positioned. We had Tucker, who really didn't have even any time to move whatsoever. We had Rolfe, whose hands were still on the steering wheel. And really it was only Tate who knew anything about what had happened. Combine that with the fact that not only were the 3 men murdered, but they also received what you would call execution shots behind the ear. All of those things point me to personally believe that this was someone who had killed before, not a mechanic who had literally stumbled down the lane with a shotgun and was ready to commit his first murder, let alone a triple murder. And also already there in that article, bearing in mind this was released just a day after the bodies were found, it's already painting a picture that we're looking for more than one perpetrator of this crime and someone who wasn't a professional hitman. Now, it may be common sense that there was more than one person involved in the actual murders themselves, but already we're getting a picture built up here of exactly how this crime was committed and potentially exactly what sort of suspect they were actually looking for. Now, the second unrelated point that I want to mention in today's video is regarding the 2 phone calls on the evening of the murders themselves. I actually made a video about this the other day, which was called "Was Crucial Evidence Missed?" Now, if we look at these 2 phone calls in front of you, these are phone calls between Michael Steele to Jack Womes. These phone calls happen at 18:03 and 18:09. The first call, I believe, lasts around 50 seconds. The second call, just over 20 seconds. Now, as I stated in that previous video, during this time, Darren Nichols claims he is in the presence of these 2 men, or at least Jack Womes at the time. Yet during his official police statement, during his testimony and his cross-examination in court, he never mentioned the fact that these phone calls ever took place. He recalls a lot of detail regarding the December the 6th and the trip to the lane and what the occupants of that vehicle were wearing, but he actually doesn't mention these phone calls whatsoever. Now, what is important about these 2 phone calls is that it's been brought to my attention that the actual cell data regarding these calls has been withheld, which means that we cannot establish the location of Steele and Wombs during the time of these calls. If we did have the cell data and we knew exactly what transmitter these calls pinged off of, it could either completely back up Darren Nichols' testimony or really blow a massive hole into it. So why has this data been withheld? Now, if we look at this logically, you could surmise that if the cell data had been withheld, it didn't really back up Darren Nichols' version of events. You can really bet your bottom dollar that if this evidence backed up what Darren Nichols was claiming, then the prosecution would have used this against Michael Steele and Jack Wombs. Yet this data and these two phone calls go completely unmentioned during the entire court case. The cell data, as I say regarding these calls, has been completely withheld. Now, what is relevant and interesting is the fact that we do have cell data for the other calls made on December the 6th. Hence, we knew that Darren Nichols was somewhere near the Wheatsheaf and somewhere near Meadow Road potentially on the evening of the murders. So it's not the fact that we don't have the cell data for more than a few calls. We just don't have the cell data for these two phone calls between Michael Steele and Jack Wombs at 1803 and 1809. Now, could it be that the prosecution realised that these calls actually took place, but they also realised that Darren Nichols never mentioned them in his statement? I always said in that previous video that if he had have mentioned these phone calls, it would have added a great deal of weight behind exactly what he was saying. If he'd have said that Michael Steele made a call to Jack when I was with him, we'd just finished putting the number plates on or trying to affix the false plates, and then Mick rang. If he'd have said that, or if he'd have made some sort of mention of those actual phone calls, it would have added so much more weight behind Darren Nichols' entire testimony. All we have really is a very sort of detailed description in some parts and quite a credible story put forward by Darren Nichols in some areas, but then in other areas it's completely lacking in any real credibility. Now, surely if you're trying to prove that you were at a location with two people, the first thing that you're going to remember is, oh yeah, Jack had a phone call when I was with him. All they've got to do is check the records. They'll see that this phone call came through. But that never happened. Nichols never mentions those two phone calls. Could it be that the prosecution realised that and then really basically just hid the cell data? They didn't want anyone else to know exactly where Steele and Wombs were at the time, and they certainly didn't use it in their prosecution case against Steele and Wombs. Now, if the cell data was made available, then it would have told us where Steele and Wombs were, or it would have given us an approximate location of where they were during the time they were supposed to have been at the pub waiting for the Range Rover to arrive. Is that why that cell data is missing? Because it actually gives us a different picture as to where these two individuals were during these phone calls. What's also worth mentioning is that the defence also had the opportunity to request this cell data, but they actually failed to do so. I don't know whether they failed to do so or whether they were actually declined to have this data, which I can't possibly believe. But it just doesn't appear anywhere in this case. It's almost as if these two phone calls never existed, but they are absolutely critical in trying to pinpoint where these two individuals who were actually convicted of triple murder, where they were, and if this ties in with Darren Nichols' testimony, which ultimately convicted them. Where is the cell data? Where are the pings which could tell us where these two individuals are? And does this or does this not match in or match up with Darren Nichols' version of events? The question that I'm asking myself is that if we have that cell data available for the other calls on that evening, what is the reason or what is the reasoning as to why this cell data for these two particular calls has been completely withheld? Why is there no mention at all of these phone calls during the summing up in court, during the cross-examination of Steele and Wombs, during the cross-examination of Darren Nichols? The calls happened. The calls lasted more than a few seconds. These phone calls were actually two people speaking to one another, yet they go completely overlooked by both the prosecution and, sadly, the defence.